Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. I hope you're staying safe and well. In today's lesson, this is our final poem we're going to be looking at from the poetry of the First World War. We're looking at another piece by Wilfred Owen, and I think another nice example of a companion piece, a piece that goes nicely together with the poem Dulce et Decorum Est, which we looked at last lesson. For that reason, and because I introduced you to Wilfred Owen and his background, and in the quiz you've taken before this lesson, you've been reminded of that prior knowledge. I'm not going to go over the context of this poem at all because it's the similar context to what we talked about last time with Wilfred Owen. Again, this is another poem that he wrote in Craig Lockhart Hospital whilst he was suffering from shell shock. As well as being influenced by Siegfried Sassoon for this poem, he also was influenced quite heavily by Robert Graves, who was another famous World War One poet who gave him feedback on this poem and helped him to rewrite it and edit it. This is a poem in which it's kind of unlike Dulce et Decorum Est in a sense, because it's written as an omniscient third-person narrative. So he's not speaking in that collective pronoun like he was in Dulce et Decorum Est. He's writing as an omniscient narrator. There are similarities. So, for example, they're both incredibly political poems. I think you could classify Disabled and Dulce et Decorum Est as anti-war poetry or protest poetry. So I think they fit into a similar category in that sense. The major difference I would say between the two poems is I see Dulce et Decorum Est as the poem that's focused on the war in the present, as it were, so on the experience of the soldier in the trenches, of the nightmarish situation that they faced, whereas Disabled is more about the aftermath, in which Owen imagines what life would be like for a returning soldier who is disabled, and very severely disabled. In the poem, it's hinted that the soldier who's the subject of the poem has lost all of their limbs. It's kind of hinted quite strongly at that. So that's a really important idea, this idea that he's disabled, that he's imagining the future for a returning soldier, which is quite unlike Dulce et Decorum Est in that sense. So it's a brilliant poem. It's quite a complex poem. There are lots of subtle underlying themes which we'll unpick as we go through. And I'll try and bring this poem to life for you over the next couple of lessons. Sorry about the cat. So let's have a look at this poem. We'll read it through first, and then I'll do a close reading afterwards. We'll go stanza by stanza. Okay, before I read through the poem for you, here is a short summary of the poem. It goes stanza by stanza, so you might want to take notes and jot the key ideas down. You might want to pause the video to give yourself longer to read these bullet points through. So you'll hear my voice again in about 30 seconds to a minute's time. So before we read the poem again, just a reminder that this is again an imaginative poem. Unlike the Dulce et Decorum Est, which was very much based on Wilfred Owen's experiences, this poem is also based on his experiences because, of course, he spent time in wartime hospitals and would have seen men suffering from these horrific injuries. But this is more of an imaginative leap for Owen about what the future would hold for these soldiers who are maimed in war returning home. So Disabled is very much a kind of rumination on what would be their reception, how they would be treated, how society would look how society would perceive them, essentially. So that's really important to remember before we read the poem. And I think it's fairly obvious from the moment this poem starts, really, that this is a poem that is fiercely political, and we'll talk about how as we read through the poem. So I'm going to read through the poem. all the way through, and then we'll go through stanza by stanza and get a better understanding of this poem. Okay, Disabled by Wilfred Owen. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddeningly, like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim, in the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands, all of them touch him like some queer disease. There was an artist silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth, last year. Now he is old, his back will never brace, he's lost his colour very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race, and let leap of purple spurted from his thigh. One time he liked a blood smear down his leg, after the matches carried shoulder high. It was after football, when he'd drunk a peg, he thought he'd better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts, that's why. And maybe, too, to please his Meg. Aye, that was it. To please the giddy jilts he asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans he scarcely thought of, and no fears of fear came yet. He thought of jewelled hilts, for daggers and plaid socks, of smart salutes, of cares of arms, and leave, and pay arrears, esprit de corps, and hints for young recruits. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer goal. Only a solemn man who bought him fruits thanks him, and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sick years in institutes, and do what things the rules consider wise, and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is! Why don't they come and put him to bed? Why don't they come? Okay, so let's have a checkpoint. The questions and the tasks I've set you are on the screen now. I forgot to add the times, but I think at least 10 minutes is how long I would spend on this task. So please follow that timing of 10 minutes. Make sure you're writing in full sentences, and pause the video, and I'll see you shortly. Okay, let's have a look at stanza 1, and we'll have a checkpoint after that. So I'll have my checkpoint marks already ready. I would suggest having a little subtitle of stanza 1. Remember, it's always beneficial for this unit to have the poem printed out in front of you. I've seen some great examples already been sent in to me of great annotations, or you're writing notes in your book. It doesn't matter which option you choose. I personally prefer having the poem in front of me, if you can. Let's read I'll read the stanza through, and then we'll go through it in more detail. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after dark, till gathering sleep had mothered them away from him. Okay, so I think what's immediately interesting about this opening stanza is the evocative and really powerful image and imagery used by Owen immediately in the poem. This image of our subject sitting in a wheeled chair. This image immediately that draws back to the title of disability, of being made, of being rendered immobile, being rendered stationary. He can't. There's automatically in this poem, or rather immediately in the poem, this idea of a lack of movement, right? He can merely sit in a wheeled chair. And we have to remember that the subject of our poem is a soldier, So it's interesting that our soldier, who is usually associated with obviously movement, with warfare, with masculinity, our soldier in this poem is in fact rendered immobile. So I'll put rendered immobile. Okay, so we've got this image, this very evocative and powerful image of being sat in a wheelchair, and the wheelchair becomes, of course, a symbol for his disability. Waiting for dark. Okay, so even the first line, there's a lot to pick out. I'm always interested in poets' decisions, and I think the decision to have him kind of anonymous is interesting, because I think again he could stand in as an everyman. He could represent any soldier who's returned from war with a disability. He's not named. He's not given a specific identity, because he's a universal figure, right? He could be any injured soldier returning from war. So he sat in a wheelchair waiting for dark. I think we can talk again. I think there are lots of subtle uses of metaphor and symbolism in this poem, but I think this is a metaphor. Waiting for dark. I think the waiting for dark represents him waiting for death. I think this is a kind of explicit reference to kind of suicidal thoughts, to the idea that his life is over since he suffered from these debilitating injuries. So the disability has brought an end to his old life, and really he's lost his purpose of life. He's lost his sense of purpose, and life has become an ordeal. So all he can do is sit immobile, waiting for dark. There's this really poignant image of a helpless soldier who's lost that sense of purpose, lost that sense of identity, and merely waits for the end of his life. That idea of this waiting for dark being a metaphor is kind of supported by the description of the suit of grey in the next line. I think that kind of adds and supports my argument that this is a metaphor for death. The suit of grey, again, it's that use of colour imagery, because obviously grey is often associated with death in literature, and I think the fact that he's wearing this kind of suit in his chair represents the dead man's suit, the funeral suit that he's dressed in. And the fact that it's ghastly, I think, is quite a powerful adjective. This idea, the idea that we're often, I think, there's something sinister and something creepy about a dead man's suit. So we've already skipped to the end of the second line, but I'll go back a little bit. And shivered in his ghastly suit of grey. I think so far the two verbs that the subject has performed: sitting, showing his immobility, showing his helplessness, showing that he's been rendered immobile, and then shivered, this idea that he seems to be it's hard. It's ambiguous. Is he shivering from cold? Is he shivering in a kind of emotional way? Is it kind of is he convulsing? Is he sobbing? It's hard to tell. But I think the idea, the word shivered for me brings in ideas of neglect, which links to the wider themes of the poem. I'm sure in your checkpoint you noticed how this poem really does criticise society, and it's criticise those who ignored the returning soldiers, or those who looked down upon returning soldiers from the First World War and did not offer them thanks, did not offer them support. I think this soldier has been neglected by his society, and that's largely linked to the fact that when soldiers returned from World War I, they didn't receive that hero's welcome because it was such a human tragedy. I think there wasn't the sense of victory. There wasn't a kind of euphoric celebration like at the end of World War II. So he's been neglected by his society, and I think Owen is implicitly criticising society. And then our first sentence, as it were, remember this line is punctuated with commas. Our sentence ends with this, again, very shocking, I think it's intended to shock, image that emphasises again the disability, just like the wheeled chair did, and it's legless, sewn short at elbow. I think it's really that one word, and the fact you're forced to pause on it. So that one adjective really emphasises his disability, the fact that he's sacrificed, his mobility, he's sacrificed his health for his country. And then we have this a double shocking, in a sense, a double shock, because we have this idea of the sewn short at the elbow. This idea that he's not only lost his legs, he's also lost his arms or his forearms. So he's essentially become completely immobile. So immobility again becomes a recurring idea throughout this poem at the beginning. So it's a really shocking image of a man who suffered dreadfully in the horrors of the First World War, in the shelling, the machine guns, the automatic weapons of war. This is the victim, and I think we see in lots of war poetry descriptions of death on an unimaginable scale. And I think what Owen is doing here is he's picking out an individual and humanizing that individual, and describing the individual's treatment by society. So we then have that caesura, and it represents a shift or a move away from the initial ideas in the opening of the poem. The opening of the poem very much focusing on the disability itself. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. Okay, let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. Okay, so we have a bit of a shift here. Remember, we've been kind of orientated in this institution. So the setting of the poem is the institution where our soldier is recovering from this debilitating injury, and where it's referenced earlier, he's facing many years of his life being spent in institutions like these. So he's sat looking out the window or by his window, waiting for dark, waiting for sleep, waiting for death. And now we have a shift, and we get a bit of a sense of the setting again. And there's a concern, I think, in this poem really with the past, and I think there's a kind of romanticization of the past. The past is the kind of idyllic country that he's left and can't return to, in a sense. So we have this description: through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day. And you've got this repetition of that phrase, voices of, that anaphora. And the voices of the boys, normally you'd associate those voices that you'd hear, playing sports on the playground, with joy, with youth. So think about what you'd associate these voices with. You'd usually associate these voices with innocence. And it's interesting that idea of the innocence, the happiness usually of the sound of children playing, is juxtaposed with the idea that it actually, for the soldier, is saddening like a hymn. So actually there's a real kind of elegiac nature to this line. And remember, elegiac from the term elegy, which we looked at way back in Ben Jonson's On My First Son. An elegy is a song for the dead. So we have this really abrupt and quite kind of shocking juxtaposition. The voices of the children, which, as I said, usually associated with joy, with happiness, with innocence, and now juxtaposed, they remind him of a hymn. And of course we can contemplate why that would be. Of course he's sacrificed his limbs, he's lost his limbs, he's lost his sense of masculinity, he's lost his mobility. And of course the voices of the boys would remind him of everything that he's lost. So again, we can kind of start to pull out some of the threads of this poem and identify one of the key themes here as being loss and a kind of grief, in a sense. The voices of play and pleasure after day, I think, is a really kind of, it doesn't remind me of Wilfred Owen. It sounds more like a nursery rhyme, and I think that's intentional. I think, again, it's about how he's reminded of his childhood, he's reminded of his youth, he's reminded of all that once was when he hears these voices of play. And to him it's heartbreaking because it reminds him of everything that's been thrown away. And then we have this interesting metaphor and the personification of sleep, I'm sure you noticed, in what is quite a difficult final line in this stanza. Till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. And you have this kind of loose rhyme scheme. Him and him, day, grey, dark, park. There is a kind of structure to this poem, and him is a kind of what we call a half rhyme. Gathering sleep is personified. We talked about that already. I'll put personified here, or just person. And I interpret this as meaning that sleep is the mother figure here, and he's mothered to sleep. He's mothered, to sleep to protect him from the voices. That's how I interpret it. I think he sees sleep as a mother-like figure because sleep is, sleep nurtures us, sleep heals us, and sleep protects us. And I think that's what's happening here. The soldier is mothered to sleep to protect him from the pain, I think, of the voices at play. That's how I interpret that stanza anyway. Okay, and then we have this full stop which adds the finality of our first image. That's our time for a checkpoint, so your questions will now appear on the screen in front of you. Please follow the timings. Okay, so here are your questions. Please make sure you're responding in full sentences. and follow the timings. Like I've said before, if you feel you need more time, that's absolutely fine. The whole point of these videos is that you can pause for longer if you need to. So do take more time if you need it, and I'll see you shortly. Okay, let's have a look at stanza 2. Again, I'll read through and then we'll go back and have a close reading. About this time town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and the girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. In the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. Okay, I find this poem. I'll be honest with you. I find it quite problematic. I find it quite difficult to read at times, and I think also uh, parts of this poem have not aged particularly well. And I think one of the aspects of this poem I find difficult as a reader is I think there is a clear element of misogyny in this poem, which means the kind of there's a sexism I think that runs throughout this poem. I think there's a really palpable dislike of women that comes through, and you might disagree with me, but I think that the female sex are presented as being quite vain, quite superficial, quite unempathetic throughout this poem. I think he really has a kind of strong dislike towards them. Maybe it's the poet, maybe it's the character, but I feel that it really does permeate throughout the poem, this dislike of women in a sense. So in this stanza we have a shift. We have a shift to one of the key themes of the poem, which is of course the past. And remember, the past is a constant source of pain for the soldier because of what he's lost in the present. So the past becomes very, very important in the poem. And we have a description to, again, this unnamed town, and how before the war, before he lost his limbs, it used to be a place of opportunity, a place of beauty, a place where he would receive attention from the opposite sex. So we have these really kind of romanticized and idyllic descriptions of the town that he grew up in, the town before he went to war. We've got this image of glow lamps. We've got lots of light imagery, and we've got light blue trees. So we've got light, lots of colour, as if the memories themselves are imbued with more colour, more warmth, because they are kind of memories that are cherished, I suppose. Maybe that he's using these, bright colours, this bright light to emphasise the positive aspects of these memories. The fact that these are the memories that he can cling on to in his current situation. So we have this idea, firstly, of the town that swung so gay. This idea that this idea that the town was a place of happiness, a place of restlessness, of a place of youth. I think the word swing really implies youth and restlessness and opportunity. We've got these beautiful image of the glow lamps budding, and this metaphor of the lights in the town flowering and blossoming, I think, which is a beautiful description. And we've got the light blue trees, that kind of very odd combination. I'm sure we noticed it. It's almost, I think it's deliberate, because obviously the colour is so wrong that I think it's deliberately trying to portray the fact that his memories are idealised, that this is kind of a dreamlike place, a utopian place for him in his imagination. So it does have this element of fantasy to it, doesn't it? The glow lamps budding and the light blue trees. So it's as if he's kind of, it's as if he's kind of moves away from reality, and his memories are now more fantastical than they actually were. We then have the introduction of women, and women become important throughout the poem, and their reaction to him is particularly important. And as I said, I'm quite uncomfortable with this poem in that sense. So the girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. This idea of him being attractive, of him being quite vain before he lost his limbs. The idea that he was attracted to the opposite sex, and he used to they used to glance at him, suggesting that he was also attractive. So there's this idea of, he's pining for his old self. He's pining for his former good looks, which he no longer has because he's not seen in the same way. Then I think this is important. We have this dash, which interrupts the poem, interrupts the flow of the poem, and it also mirrors a kind of emphasis, I suppose, which is that we're certainly talking about the past. So these descriptions are from a time that's in the old times. It almost sounds like a fairy tale in the olden days. This is a time that's now part of the past, a time that cannot be recovered, that cannot be relived. It's gone. And that's emphasised by the next clause, before he threw away his knees. And I'm sure we all noticed that particular line because it's quite candid, quite shocking when we read it the first time. I think the key part of it is the verb choice of threw away, because for me that implies that there wasn't really a reason for doing so. If you throw something away, there's this idea of carelessness, this idea that it's quite a casual verb to use, threw away. And again, I think it suggests a waste in a sense. So just to be clear, and for clarity's sake, I think what Owen is hinting at here is the idea that the soldier has thrown away his legs for no real purpose, for no real cause. And we saw that in Dulce et Decorum Est, the idea of the soldiers being disillusioned, that they've lost sight and lost belief in what they're actually fighting for. So this soldier has thrown away his knees for no real cause. So again, I think what Owen is doing subtly is questioning the morality of this war that has destroyed the lives and taken the lives of so many young men like this soldier. Okay, we then have another full stop, and we have a shift to I suppose the character's thought process. It's kind of as if the writer is trying to track the ruminations and reflections of the subject. Now he will, and we go back to the now as well. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. I'll talk about this simile, which is of course really upsetting, I think, afterwards. I think what's hinted at, we know that he's lost his arms and legs. There is, I think, a very strong hint in these lines that essentially he's full of regrets for the fact that he will not ever experience a mutual desire. He won't be able to have physical intimacy with a woman again. That's what he's kind of thinking about. That's what he's ruminating about. This idea of intimacy being something that's part of his past. So he won't feel the slim girl's waist, which clearly is kind of quite a reference to kind of sexual intimacy. He won't feel the warmth of their subtle hands. So I think what's going on here is there's a strong hint from Owen that our subject is also impotent, which means he's unable to perform sexually. I think he's been injured in that sense as well. So there's this kind of, again, another ghastly image of his disability. And then we have this kind of, again, this juxtaposition, because the previous two lines were kind of, again, images of desire and attraction and intimacy. And then we have this image, the shocking image, which is all of them touch him like some queer disease, which, of course, desire is all about mutual attraction, right? And here we have this idea, clearly the women are now repulsed or disgusted by him. So they see him as being, this kind of monstrous figure. They see him as, I think it's such a powerful simile because they see him as being less than human. They see him as being subhuman, as being something that is clearly contagious, something that should be avoided. And I think this is a very, very charged simile. I think it's politically loaded. I think this is a criticism, isn't it, of women who've been at home waiting for their men to return home from 4 years of warfare. And I think it's about the hypocrisy he feels that they've exhibited in not being grateful enough, and not recognizing the sacrifice that our soldier has performed in throwing away his knees, as it were, for his country. So it's a really politically loaded and critical simile. I think it really is quite powerful, and it reminds me of those posters I showed you earlier on in the Poetry Through Time unit when we started looking at World War One, of women, urging their men to go and fight in the trenches. I think this is his way of challenging and criticizing women for their role in recruiting soldiers, perhaps. It's a very shocking simile nonetheless. Okay, so we've come to another checkpoint, and you'll see the questions that you're going to answer on the board. Please again take your time to answer them. Please make sure that you write in full sentences, and please make sure that if you feel you need more time, take the time. It's absolutely fine. See you shortly. Welcome back. We've come to the end of part 1 of this video series on the poem Disabled by Wilfred Owen. I'll see you next time for part 2, where we'll look at stanzas 3, 4 and 5. Make sure you stay safe and stay well. Please now complete your independent tasks and your quiz on Show My Homework. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.